You are living in a world where a single tweet or a single decision made in Washington or Tehran can quietly wipe out your savings, your retirement fund, and your dream of a secure life. If you think the conflict between the US and Iran is just a story happening on the other side of the globe, you might already be standing in the eye of the storm without even knowing it. This video is different because it does not just repeat clickbait headlines. Instead, it dissects a US and Iran conflict scenario through the lens of geopolitics, economics, and the psychology of power. It treats it as a prolonged chess match, where every single decision carries a tangible cost, measured in blood inflation and political instability. We will navigate through three layers: Washington's maneuvers, Tehran's survival strategy, and the cold calculations of the Gulf states and Beijing. This will reveal the full picture that your daily news broadcasts only show from a very narrow angle. The context is clear. Since the early 2020s, US and Iran tensions have been steadily accumulating. Attacks on energy infrastructure, disruptions to strategic maritime routes, and hardline televised statements are weaving a web of risk. Financial markets, oil prices, American inflation, and voter confidence will all have to pay the price. In our flat global economy, a military decision made halfway across the world can directly impact gas prices, mortgage rates, and the job market you rely on. Why would a war in the Middle East between the US and Iran touch your credit card, your mortgage, or even your ability to keep your job over the next 2 to 3 years? Once you understand the answer, you will no longer view this conflict as a distant news story, but as a critical variable in the equation of your own life. First, an important disclaimer. What you are about to hear is an independent analysis based on widely available data and trends. This is not investment advice, it is not a political endorsement, and it is certainly not a guaranteed prediction of the future. Any assertion in this video could be challenged or even entirely debunked if new information emerges. In short, consider this a cognitive map, not a contract of belief. I am Tommy, and my channel provides comprehensive objective analysis of the US and global economy. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon next to it, so you will not miss our future videos. Understanding the US and Iran chessboard is not just a hobby for political junkies. It is a survival skill in an economy deeply tethered to the rest of the world. No single side holds a monopoly on the truth. Every government will spin the narrative in a way that benefits them most. If you are waiting for a simple right versus wrong or hero versus villain storyline, this video will likely make you uncomfortable. But if you accept that this world is complex and sometimes ruthless, then a multidimensional perspective will be your best weapon against being manipulated. Imagine sitting in a closed-door boardroom where governments, mega corporations, central banks, and other major powers are gathered. On the table, there are not just military maps, but also charts tracking the flow of oil, natural gas, capital, and market confidence. The people in that room are not just asking if we can defeat Iran. They are asking if oil prices stay at this level for 6 months. What must we do with interest rates, the national budget, and the upcoming elections? From that perspective, the US and Iran conflict is a stress test for 3 things simultaneously. First, it tests the resilience of the American economy against external shocks. Second, it tests the public's trust in their government, especially when the stated reasons for war and its actual costs begin to diverge. Third, it tests the global power structure as other players like the Gulf states and China see an opportunity to exploit the vacuum left by the US. Let us start from the place where all decisions converge, the White House. When Americans vote, they are not just selecting an individual. They are choosing how the world will be perceived and handled. A president obsessed with clear-cut televised victories will view the Iran crisis very differently from a president who believes in long-term wars for the sake of a democratic mission. It is the exact same military machine, but how it is used, limited, and concluded is entirely different. In the first 2 decades of this century, the United States endured 2 painful experiences, Afghanistan and Iraq. Both began with the promise of swift campaigns and clear objectives. Both ended as decades-long wars that consumed trillions of dollars, cost thousands of soldiers' lives, and left deep scars on American society. Since then, the phrase of being bogged down in the Middle East is no longer just a strategic concept, but a political nightmare. Any president understands that allowing America to slide into an endless war will almost certainly jeopardize their own career. Therefore, when analyzing a military campaign against Iran, the first thing we must distinguish is the official objective presented to the public versus the real objective debated by the national security team behind closed doors. On television, the language always revolves around the word threat. A threat to U.S. security, to our allies, to the international order. Speeches will talk about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, protecting commercial shipping, and retaliating against attacks on American forces. These are the justifications most easily digested by voters. But in internal documents, the story is far more complex. Advisors will lay out different scenarios. If we do not act, how much further will Iran advance in its nuclear program? And how long until they possess a significant deterrent against U.S. allies in the region? If we do act, how many weeks will it take? How many airstrikes? How many warships? And how will that cost impact the federal budget, especially when our fiscal deficit is already critically high? At the same time, they have to weigh the trade-offs. Every bomb dropped on Iran is another brick in the wall of public skepticism, raising the question of whether America has truly learned its lesson from previous wars. Why does this matter to the American people? Because every military decision, no matter how beautifully packaged, is fundamentally an allocation of resources. War money does not materialize out of thin air. It comes from taxes, from national debt, and from the future ability to fund infrastructure, education, and healthcare. When an administration chooses to prioritize a Middle Eastern campaign, they are simultaneously accepting the sacrifice or delay of other domestic priorities. If you are a taxpayer, a wage earner, or a parent sending your child to a public school, this is no longer a distant narrative. It is your reality. However, talking about money is not enough. In a democracy, decisions of war are also scrutinized through a legal lens. The U.S. Constitution is very clear. The power to declare war resides with Congress. The president has the authority to order military action in certain emergencies, but that power is not absolute. After the Vietnam War, when the public realized that a president could gradually drag the entire country into an undeclared, unchecked war, Congress passed laws to reassert its oversight authority. In the context of the Iran campaign, the question becomes, has this boundary been crossed? When the White House describes the campaign as self-defense against an imminent threat, but classified briefings to Congress talk more about eliminating Iran as a long-term threat to the regional order, the discrepancy is more than just semantics. It is the foundation for legal debates. It opens the door for lawmakers to ask, are we witnessing a constitutional act of self-defense or an unauthorized war for regime change? From the perspective of an American voter, you might think these debates are too abstract, but try to look at it differently. When a president is accused of abusing military power, what signal does that send to future presidents? If there are no political or legal consequences, the threshold for military action will steadily drop. Conversely, if the pushback is too severe, the ability to respond swiftly to genuine threats could be compromised. Every crisis of this nature presents America with a puzzle how to protect national security without destroying the very mechanisms that protect our liberty. Another undeniable factor is the election cycle. No president wants to enter midterms or a general election dragging a bloody, costly, open-ended war, especially while the economy shows signs of weakening under the weight of inflation. Historical data shows that in the U.S., an unpopular war coupled with an economic downturn is an almost guaranteed recipe for political turnover. In other words, voters might support a military campaign for the first few weeks, but once they start paying for it at the gas pump, at the grocery store, or through unemployment, that support evaporates very quickly. So why, knowing all these risks, Would an administration still choose to step into the vortex with Iran? The answer lies in the fact that inaction also comes with a price. If the White House believes Iran is approaching a nuclear threshold or developing a deterrent capability that will be too costly to reverse, later accepting the price tag right now is sometimes seen as cutting losses early. They will argue that a short, limited war can prevent a far more dangerous confrontation down the road. The problem is that in reality, a limited war rarely stays neatly within the boundaries that were initially drawn. That is why in this analysis, we do not just stop at the question of whether the US can win on the battlefield. In terms of sheer military capability, the answer is fairly obvious. The more nuanced question is, can America achieve its political objectives at a price the American public is willing to accept? What exactly is that objective? Is it neutralizing Iran's nuclear program, changing their behavior in the region, or sending a message of deterrence to other adversaries? Each definition of the objective leads to a very different metric for winning and losing. Let us temporarily leave Washington and step into another city, where air raid sirens, the roar of jets, and closed-door meetings in underground bunkers form the baseline rhythm of political life. To understand Iran, we cannot merely view them as an adversary in Western news broadcasts. We must see them as an actor, playing a game of survival, driven by a long historical memory, a constant fear of being overthrown, and the belief that only hard power is enough to prevent deep foreign intervention. In the eyes of many Americans, Iran is the troublemaker of the Middle East, the source of proxy forces, and a direct threat to Israel and our allies. But if you ask an Iranian who lived through the war with Iraq in the 1980s, they will tell you a very different story. They remember their country being attacked with the backing of multiple global powers. They remember chemical weapons and the feeling of isolation when most of the world chose to stand by or quietly support their enemy. From those memories, a collective psychology was forged. The world is not kind to us, and if we do not protect ourselves, no one else will. Within that framework, their nuclear program, missile arsenal, and network of proxy forces are not merely tools for disruption, but a shield for survival. Every time they are threatened with regime change, and every time calls for reform from the outside are broadcast from Washington or Europe, Tehran finds another reason to tighten its grip. To them, the greatest mistake would be showing weakness right when their opponent is trying to corner them. This does not make every action taken by Iran morally right, but it helps decode why even after suffering heavy losses from airstrikes, they can still declare victory, continue firing missiles, and maintain a defiant tone. Let us look back at a precedent following a massive strike on their nuclear infrastructure. When many observers believed Iran had been set back years from its goals, the supreme leader appeared on national television and declared that the enemy had achieved nothing significant. The Revolutionary Guards went even further, describing their own retaliatory strikes as the catalyst that forced the opponent to accept a ceasefire. From the outside, Western media described that speech as detached from reality. But for a society accustomed to living in a tightly controlled information environment, the official narrative carries its own distinct power. It is also worth remembering that this is not the first time a regime has utilized this logic. After the first Gulf War, the Iraqi military was heavily defeated. Its military capabilities were slashed, and its economy fell into a severe crisis. Nevertheless, the leadership managed to hold on to power, and because he was still sitting in the big chair, he granted himself the right to declare a victory against the US-led coalition. The logic is remarkably simple. If the strong arrive, drop bombs, and then withdraw without toppling the regime can rewrite the story to its own advantage. In Iran, following the latest wave of attacks, a new variable has emerged: the assassination of the supreme leader. This is a massive symbolic loss, not only religiously, but politically as well. However, the clerical leadership quickly selected an internal successor, choosing the son of the former leader. This is a move laden with historical irony, as a republic born from the overthrow of a monarchy now witnesses power passing from father to son. In the long run, this could generate severe internal friction. But in the short term, the outward message is crystal clear. The machine is still running, and there is no power vacuum. The ideal scenario for Tehran looks like this. The US initiates a medium-term withdrawal, making no attempt at occupation or regime change. Iran then declares that the empire was forced to retreat, framing the narrative as a heroic defensive victory. The new leader steps up as the heir to a spiritual legacy, transforming into a wartime leader and solidifying legitimacy in the eyes of a segment of the population. The price paid in blood and military infrastructure is colossal. But if the regime survives in their logic, it is still a strategic triumph. From a game theory perspective, if Iran maintains its regime after a targeted attack by a superpower, the message sent to smaller nations globally will be highly significant. They will see that in a world where regime change wars were once used as standard foreign policy tools, there is still a viable path of enduring pain to ensure survival. This short-term agony could be interpreted by other regimes as an insurance policy for their long-term existence. That is a signal Washington certainly does not want to broadcast. Yet it becomes incredibly difficult to control once a military campaign has been launched. However, all of this is only possible if Iran refrains from pushing the Gulf states into a corner where they can no longer remain neutral. This is a variable that many people underestimate. The nations of the Gulf Cooperation Council have been trying to walk a very thin tightrope. They are maintaining security ties with the US while keeping diplomatic channels open with Iran, desperately trying to avoid becoming a battlefield for either side. They rely on maritime security, stable oil prices, and international capital flows just as much as any developed economy. When Iran launches attacks within the airspace or territory of these nations, hitting not just military bases, but also damaging civilian infrastructure, airports, and residential areas, the logic of neutrality begins to fracture. Televised diplomacy attempts to distinguish between American targets and the territory of Islamic neighbors. But missile fragments and drone debris falling on hotels, factories, and neighborhoods tell a very different story. Every civilian casualty acts as a potential vote for a much harder line in domestic foreign policy. Despite this up to the point described in our scenario, most Gulf states have stopped at issuing strong condemnations. They invoke the right to self-defense under the UN Charter, but they do not declare war, they do not cut diplomatic ties, and they do not officially join a military coalition against Iran. Only a few nations that suffered the heaviest damages have taken harsher steps, such as recalling ambassadors or partially closing embassies. The rest choose to keep communication lines open, refusing to drastically expand base access for US forces. This is not a matter of moral neutrality. It is pragmatic neutrality. They understand that Washington might withdraw its forces, pivot its strategy, or change presidents in just a few years. But Iran is a permanent neighbor, sharing their waters, their airspace, and the energy market for generations to come. Entering a total war with Iran to satisfy a temporary US administration could carry a geopolitical price tag that lasts for decades. Some foreign policy analyses have pointed out that instead of separating the Gulf states from America, Iran's attacks risk pushing them closer to Washington, ultimately depriving Tehran of the very mediators it might need. The least worst scenario for the Gulf in this context requires two things. First, Iran must exercise self-restraint regarding civilian targets and energy infrastructure, unless they want to force the Gulf states into picking a side. Second, diplomatic channels, including unofficial ones through Oman, Qatar, or external mediators, must be utilized to their absolute fullest to keep the door open for de-escalation. Every passing day that brings another closed airport or another paralyzed oil port is a day that steadily erodes the remaining space for a diplomatic solution. From the perspective of the Gulf, the goal is not to win a US and Iran war. The goal is to survive with the fewest scars possible to maintain their role as mediators when needed, and to protect their economic transition away from oil, a vision upon which they have bet their entire future. They understand one thing with absolute clarity. In a war where all sides desperately need an exit strategy, The player holding the middle ground is the most valuable asset on the board. But that asset could evaporate entirely with just a few more strikes. In this tangled picture, there is one character who has not fired a single shot, yet holds the strongest economic leverage: China. Mainstream media largely focuses on images of missiles, warships, and hardline statements. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, there is a flurry of phone calls between Beijing and Tehran, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Tel Aviv, Moscow, and Brussels. China is not a frontline soldier, but it is the region's largest energy customer. This is especially true for oil and liquefied natural gas passing through maritime routes that are currently under threat. In recent years, the percentage of China's imported oil traveling through Gulf Straits, particularly Hormuz, accounts for a massive share of their total energy imports. Saudi Arabia alone exports over 1.5 million barrels of oil to China every single day. Qatar supplies a huge portion of the liquefied natural gas needed for their industry and power grid. If these bottlenecks are locked down for weeks, the Chinese economy, which is already under structural pressure, will immediately face a dual risk: supply disruption and extreme price volatility. However, what sets Beijing's position apart from Europe or Japan is its energy security structure. China has invested heavily in oil and gas pipelines from Russia and Central Asia, while simultaneously maintaining a portion of domestic oil production. They possess strategic reserves and have the capacity to redirect some demand to overland supply routes if maritime lanes are disrupted. Combine this with the fact that China is practically the only customer buying Iranian oil in bulk amidst heavy sanctions against Tehran. The leverage here is not simply that you have oil and I need it, but rather, I am the last major buyer you have left. The unspoken message Beijing sends to Tehran is very simple. If you keep the strait stable enough for oil and gas tankers to navigate, we will continue to buy, maintaining the flow of foreign currency for your economy. If you turn these waters into a prolonged battlefield, we have the option to gradually shift to supplies from Russia and other nations. For an economy laboring under severe sanctions, locked out of almost all Western markets, losing its key Asian customer is not an abstract risk. It is a threat to its very survival. Yet even here, things are not so simple. From a strategic viewpoint, China is also watching the tensions between the US and Iran very closely. Every week, Washington has to spend more on troop deployments and maintaining a naval presence. And every time the US financial market shakes because of oil prices, it adds a small point to the long-term equation of great power competition. Beijing must weigh two risks: the short-term pain to its own economy due to partial supply disruption versus the long-term gain if America is dragged deeper into a war of attrition. In short, China has the incentive to de-escalate, but also the incentive to wait and see if prolonged tension forces its strategic rival to pay a heavier price. Every phone call, every statement urging restraint must be read within that context. China could play the role of mediator, just as it did in the agreement restoring relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023. If they can repeat that success, the image of a peacemaker will be an incredibly valuable soft asset in the eyes of the developing world, who are suffering the economic consequences of a war they have nothing to do with. However, they could also choose to let things simmer at a moderate level if they believe the financial and political price America pays benefits their long-term ambitions. That is why, when looking at China's role, we should not just ask what they can do. We must ask what they want from a new Middle Eastern order over the next 10 or 20 years. After traversing 5 different perspectives, the American public, the White House, Tehran, the Gulf, and Beijing, we now have a multi-dimensional picture. Let us briefly summarize the chessboard one more time. The US is seeking to achieve a dual objective. It wants to neutralize Iran's military and nuclear capabilities, enough to ensure the security of its allies and its own deterrence credibility, but without getting bogged down in a protracted war like Afghanistan or Iraq. Iran is trying to prove that despite being heavily attacked, the regime stands firm can still retaliate and can still tell the story that they survived the superpower. The Gulf states are doing everything they can to avoid becoming a battlefield, maintaining their role as mediators and protecting their economic transition journey. Meanwhile, China is simultaneously trying to protect its energy sources while observing whether this crisis might weaken America's long-term position. In this context, the least worst scenario is not a permanent peace treaty, nor is it a miraculous democratic revolution. It is much more modest. It is a tacit agreement where each side swallows a portion of their losses and saves face at a minimal level in exchange for a ceasefire and de-escalation. For the US, that could mean declaring the military mission accomplished after destroying a large portion of Iran's military infrastructure and then shifting focus to economic and diplomatic sanctions. For Iran, it could mean agreeing to halt direct attacks on the Gulf and scaling back the blockade of maritime routes. In return, they get the right to broadcast domestic propaganda, claiming they forced the enemy to retreat. The Gulf states in this scenario will act as the pressure release valve of the system. They will continue to strongly condemn any action that threatens their security, but at the same time, they will keep diplomatic lines open with both Washington and Tehran. They will not allow their territory to be used for expanding campaigns spiraling out of control, but they also will not slam the door on US forces to the point of losing their basic security umbrella. They will use their influence to push for a kind of cold ceasefire, just enough to calm the energy markets and enough to keep their massive economic projects from going bankrupt. China, in this picture, will use its economic leverage to lower the temperature rather than test the fire. They will tell Iran, if you keep the maritime routes reasonably safe, and if you reduce the level of threat to the Gulf, we will continue to buy oil and provide a certain level of trade support. Simultaneously, they will signal to the US and Europe that a stable China, one that does not complicate the situation further, is part of the solution, not part of the problem. In exchange, they will demand a higher standing in international forums and in negotiations over trade, climate, and technology. For the American public, what impact does this least worst scenario have? It means the war does not drag on to the point of triggering another explosion of inflation. It means avoiding gas and food prices reaching levels that could shake the entire middle class. It means the Federal Reserve does not have to keep interest rates higher than expected for years, just because of a conflict on the other side of the globe. It means the risk of mass unemployment or a deep recession lasting multiple quarters becomes far less likely. No one completely escapes the cost of this shock, but that cost remains within a range that society can absorb. However, for this least worst scenario to unfold, at least 4 conditions must be met. First, the White House must accept that it cannot teach Iran a final lesson by prolonging the campaign to the point of regime change. Second, Iranian leadership must accept that proving they will not surrender does not require attacking to the point of forcing the Gulf states to pick a side. They must realize that losing Gulf mediators means cutting off their own lifeline. Third, the Gulf states must have the resolve to withstand public pressure and avoid overreacting, while still sending a clear signal that they will not accept becoming a battlefield. Fourth, China must conclude that a relatively stable Middle East, with oil and gas continuing to flow, benefits them more than a chaotic Middle East that bogs down America, but simultaneously destabilizes the global economy. These are 4 distinct conditions resting within 4 different centers of power. If just one of the 4 decides to move in the opposite direction, this least worst scenario will begin to fracture. The question is, how much time do we have left before that door closes? War has a ruthless rule. Every passing day that brings more casualties, more destroyed infrastructure, and more hardline public rhetoric is another day that makes turning back increasingly difficult for all sides. A leader who promised millions of viewers that he will not negotiate unless the opponent unconditionally surrenders will find it very hard to sit at a negotiating table and sign an unimpressive deal. A new leader in Tehran, having just taken over following an assassination, will find it incredibly difficult to explain to domestic hardliners why he backed down so early. The financial market has a similar threshold for tolerance. Investors can stomach a period of volatility, a few weeks of high oil prices, and several trading sessions in the red. But if the signals from the battlefield keep deteriorating, if American fiscal and monetary policies require drastic adjustments, and if corporate earnings reports start flooding with warnings, market sentiment will shift from cautious to panicked. At that point, sell-offs, credit tightening, and investment cuts will unfold at an uncontrollable pace. A geopolitical crisis can rapidly mutate into a financial crisis. Every day that passes without a clear signal of de-escalation, every day without a genuine step toward a tacit agreement, drags all of us closer to the bad scenario. That is why understanding early, preparing early, and adjusting expectations early is so critical. You cannot control the decisions made in Washington, Tehran, Riyadh, or Beijing, but you can control how you allocate risk, how you plan, and how you read the news. On a personal level, the lesson here is not to flee the market or to go all in on a single investment vehicle. The lesson is, do not be caught off guard. Understand that in an interconnected world, a war that sounds far away can be the origin of the next interest rate hike of your company, downsizing, or of your dream of buying a home being pushed back a few years. If you accept that reality, you will find the motivation to equip yourself with knowledge of geopolitics, economics, and finance as an indispensable part of your own personal insurance. We have traveled a long journey, from the perspective of the American public to the mechanics of power in Washington, to the fears and survival logic of Iran, the dilemma of the Gulf states, and finally, the long-term calculations of China. No single perspective is enough on its own, but when pieced together, they provide a reasonably clear map of how the world operates around this war. There are no beautiful endings. There are only less ugly ones. Our mission as people living in the world of consequences is to identify those exits early, clearly understand the price tag of each scenario, and prepare a path through the storm that minimizes our losses. The final question for you is not which side you stand on. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? I am Tommy, and my channel provides comprehensive objective analysis of the US and global economy. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon next to it, so you will not miss our future videos. Thank you for listening.